Shame arrives before grief has learned its proper weight. It settles first, uninvited and relentless, pressing upon the chest until sorrow itself must make room. Eleanor Whitcombe felt it on the morning she returned to her native parish, not as tears, nor as memory, but as the quiet certainty that the world had already decided what she was worth, and that it would not be generous. Her father was scarcely cold in his grave before judgment took form. It spoke in lowered voices, in careful pauses, in the sudden politeness of those who once called upon her family with ease. Reduced circumstances, they named it, as though the phrase itself were an ailment. Eleanor did not dispute it. She had come home to settle accounts, to tend to tenants who looked to her for direction, to prove, perhaps only to herself, that usefulness could outlast comfort. Yet usefulness was not admired in a young woman, and certainly not in one without fortune to soften it. She moved through the days with a composure learned early, one polished by necessity rather than approval. There was dignity in her bearing, though it earned her little kindness. The matron saw calculation where there was resolve, the young lady saw competition where there was none. Eleanor heard her name spoken as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how swiftly a family might descend. Each word landed without spectacle, but together they formed a verdict she could not escape. At the center of every whispered comparison stood a man she had never met. The Duke of Ashbourne had become, in absence, a measuring stick for all female ambition in the county. He rejected proposals with a regularity that inspired both fascination and resentment. Some called it pride, others damage, still others cruelty. He remained silent, which only sharpened speculation. To be refused by the Duke was humiliation, to be ignored by him entirely was worse. Eleanor, it was agreed, need not trouble herself with either fate. She first learned this when a remark, not meant for her ears, reached them all the same. A gentlewoman, well-placed and well-married, laughed softly as she spoke. Even the Duke, she said, would never choose a woman so intent on ledgers and labor. Eleanor did not turn. She did not protest. She accepted the sentence with the calm of one long accustomed to restraint. Yet something shifted within her then, subtle but irrevocable, as though a door had been closed without ceremony. Duty, however, has a way of insisting upon its own paths. The winter proved severe, and hardship revealed itself where pride had once concealed it. Rents went unpaid, stores ran low, and the old assurances of stability faltered. Eleanor wrote letters, sought counsel, and at last was told that decisions must be made beyond her authority. The estate that could intervene belonged to Ashbourne. The man who must be addressed was the Duke himself. Their introduction, when it came, was formal in the extreme. He was courteous, distant, precise. His voice carried neither warmth nor disdain, only a careful neutrality that suggested long practice. Eleanor spoke plainly, not to impress, but to be understood. She described the cold, the hunger, the quiet desperation that winter pressed upon those without protection. She asked for nothing beyond what was reasonable. He listened without interruption, his attention focused in a manner that felt unsettlingly complete. When she finished, there was no immediate reply. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it was charged, as though something unspoken had been placed between them. At last, he acknowledged her request and promised consideration. No more, no less. Eleanor departed with no sense of triumph, yet with an unfamiliar awareness that she had been seen not as an inconvenience, but as a presence. In the days that followed, small mercies appeared without explanation. Fuel arrived where none had been expected. Provisions were distributed with efficiency and discretion. Gratitude followed, though Eleanor claimed no credit. Others, less restrained, drew conclusions. Kindness, once again, became suspect when directed without ceremony. Eleanor felt the scrutiny tighten, yet she refused to shrink beneath it. What unsettled her most was not the renewed gossip, but the memory of the Duke's attention, steady and unreadable. She had not sought it, yet it lingered. It reminded her that isolation was not solely her burden, that refusal could be a kind of exile, and that solitude, chosen too often, might harden into fate. As the winter deepened, so too did the sense that something fragile had been set in motion. Eleanor stood between necessity and judgment, between duty and the quiet yearning she refused to name. Somewhere beyond her immediate reach, a man renowned for denial faced the same cold she did, though of a different kind. It was not affection that troubled her thoughts, but consequence. Every choice she made now seemed to echo beyond its moment, as though the smallest act might tip a balance she could not yet see. Resolve alone could not quiet the sense of approach, the awareness that paths once parallel had begun to angle inward. The Duke, she learned indirectly, had declined another proposal, rich in advantage and loudly praised. The refusal stirred fresh comment, and with it a curious alignment of their names in conversation. Eleanor heard this with a measured breath, neither flattered nor alarmed, only aware that distance was narrowing. When next she prepared to address estate matters, a summons arrived bearing Ashbourne's seal. It was brief, impersonal, and unmistakable. He requested her presence to discuss further provisions for the winter. Eleanor folded the paper, her pulse betraying calm. She understood then that the reprieve she sought through duty had instead drawn her closer to the very solitude she mirrored. Whatever awaited her beyond that invitation would not be refused without cost, and the winter had not yet spoken its final yet. Still, tragedy does not announce itself with spectacle, it enters as consequence. It arrived for Eleanor Whitcombe in the form of gratitude that turned sour, of help rendered and then recast as intent. Mercy, she learned, carries a price when it passes through too many mouths. The winter's relentlessness sharpened tempers. Relief given quietly did not remain so. Names were attached, motives invented, and Eleanor's became the most convenient. She was said to have influence beyond her station, to have secured aid through means unfit for mention. The rumor did not accuse her of vice outright, it was worse than that. It suggested design. Eleanor felt the accusation settle upon her reputation like a verdict rendered without trial, and she recognized in it a familiar cruelty, that a woman's competence must always be explained by favor. She did not seek the Duke's company again. She kept her correspondence precise and infrequent, her requests confined to necessity. Yet the aid continued, measured and effective, and with it the murmurs grew. Eleanor faced them with composure, but composure is a discipline, not an armor. It requires constant attention, and even then it frays. When the summons came again from Ashbourne, it did not flatter her. It burdened her. The Duke's note was brief, scrupulously formal, and impossible to refuse without harm to those she served. Eleanor accepted with the calm of obligation, though the air between their names had thickened since last they met. The Duke received her with the same reserve, though something had altered in the interval. He spoke of provisions, of contracts, of measures to sustain the parish through the remaining cold. Eleanor responded with facts and figures, refusing the intimacy of conjecture. They worked efficiently, two minds aligned by necessity, and when the matter was concluded, she prepared to depart without expectation. It was then that he acknowledged the rumors. He did not name them, nor did he apologize for their existence. He stated, with a precision that carried weight, that he would not have his actions misunderstood as patronage offered in exchange for anything but competence. The distinction was deliberate. Eleanor understood at once that he was defending not only her, but himself. She accepted the boundary gratefully, though it underscored the danger of even unintentional closeness. Days passed, and with them came a smaller kindness, unmistakably personal. A book returned to her bearing, pressed between its pages, a winter rose dried to memory. There was no message, no claim of sentiment. The gesture was restrained, almost severe, and therefore impossible to dismiss. Eleanor felt its presence like a question she had not agreed to answer. The town noticed. It always did. What had once been suspicion hardened into something sharper. Eleanor was warned by well-meaning acquaintances to be cautious, to guard herself against misinterpretation. She listened, thanked them, and continued as before. Yet the rose remained, and with it the awareness that the Duke's restraint mirrored her own, each testing the limits of propriety without crossing them. A misstep came regardless. An evening consultation extended too long. A storm delayed her return. Circumstance, indifferent to reputation, provided opportunity. Eleanor insisted upon distance, upon witnesses, upon decorum. Even so, the next morning carried whispers that no care could wholly erase. She felt the weight of them press upon her resolve, and for the first time considered retreat not as prudence, but as surrender. The Duke, when he heard, did not rage. He did not summon or scold. He acted. A public clarification, spare and unmistakable, ended speculation by naming Eleanor's role with authority and respect. He attributed decisions to her judgment without embellishment. The defense was clean, and therefore devastating to those who thrived on ambiguity. Eleanor understood the cost. By speaking, he had bound his reputation to hers. By remaining silent before, he had nearly ruined her. The balance between those truths unsettled her. Gratitude warred with caution, and beneath them both stirred an unfamiliar warmth she refused to indulge. She resolved to withdraw as winter allowed, to reduce contact, to restore distance. The decision steadied her. It also wounded her in ways she did not anticipate. Duty, once her refuge, now felt like an exile she imposed upon herself. The Duke sent no more tokens. His assistance continued through channels made deliberately impersonal. Eleanor felt the loss keenly, though she told herself it was relief. Silence, she discovered, could ache as much as scrutiny. Then the cold worsened, and necessity collapsed her careful plans. A storm immobilized the parish, isolating Ashbourne and those who depended upon it. Eleanor was compelled to return, not as a visitor, but as the sole intermediary capable of decision. She went with resolve sharpened by restraint, determined to complete the work and depart unchanged. What awaited her was not scandal, nor kindness, but a reckoning deferred too long. The Duke received her with gravity, and when he spoke, it was not of winter or provisions, but of solitude chosen and borne. Eleanor listened, the rose heavy in her pocket, and understood that the restraint they shared had reached its limit, and that silence would no longer suffice for either of them. He spoke without appeal, as one accustomed to refusals that echo. He named the cost of isolation with a candor that startled her, admitting that denial had become habit, and habit had hardened into shelter. Eleanor felt the moment tilt, not toward romance, but toward truth. She answered with care, asserting the dignity she would not relinquish, the line she would not cross, and the people who depended upon her steadiness. Between them formed an understanding as fragile as it was necessary. When he asked her to remain until the storm broke, not as obligation but as choice, Eleanor hesitated, sensing that assent would alter more than circumstance. The winter, she realized, had narrowed to a single question, and it waited for her reply. She drew breath, aware that whatever answer followed would decide who she became next alone perhaps. Tragedy struck not as loss, but as realization. Eleanor understood, with a clarity that stung, that staying had changed her already, and that departure would not restore what restraint had quietly undone. She remained at Ashbourne because the roads were impassable and because duty demanded it, yet beneath both reasons lay a third: she refused to speak. The Duke did not press her. He treated her presence as necessity alone, and in that careful courtesy she sensed the weight of his own vigilance. They existed in proximity without indulgence, bound by circumstance and a shared discipline that allowed no careless word. Time slowed into deliberate moments. Decisions were made, orders dispatched, responsibilities met. Eleanor fulfilled each task with precision, but awareness threaded through her composure. She felt observed not as spectacle, but as consideration. The Duke's attention did not seek to claim, it sought to understand. That difference unsettled her more than open pursuit ever could. It was Eleanor who spoke first, though not of what pressed hardest. She thanked him for his public defense, acknowledging the cost it had carried. He accepted neither gratitude nor apology, stating simply that accuracy mattered, and that silence in the face of distortion was a form of consent. The conviction with which he said it revealed more than courtesy, it revealed principle. Encouraged by that truth, she ventured further. She spoke of reputation as inheritance, fragile and unequally distributed. She named the exhaustion of restraint, the vigilance required of women whose errors were never forgiven. Her words were measured, yet beneath them ran a quiet intensity. She did not ask for reassurance. She stated fact. The Duke listened without interruption. When he responded, it was not to contradict, but to confess. He admitted that refusal had become his shield, that he had learned early how expectation hollowed affection, how admiration curdled into demand. He spoke of choice narrowed by lineage, of solitude embraced because it could not betray him. His voice carried no self-pity, only recognition. The exchange altered the air between them. It was not intimacy, but alignment. Eleanor saw in his isolation a mirror distorted by privilege rather than poverty. Both had learned to survive by retreat, though the world judged only one of them harshly for it. That understanding softened something guarded within her, even as it sharpened her caution. Night advanced without ceremony. The storm pressed on, unrelenting. Conversation waned, yet presence remained. They shared a silence that did not accuse, a rare thing. Eleanor felt the weight of it settle, not as pressure, but as possibility, and the realization frightened her more than scandal ever had. When the Duke spoke again, his words carried the gravity of decision. He said that solitude, chosen too often, becomes a kind of cowardice. He acknowledged that he had mistaken avoidance for discipline, and restraint for virtue. The admission was not theatrical, it was restrained to the point of severity. Eleanor understood the effort it cost him. She answered with restraint of her own. She did not offer consolation. She did not encourage hope. Instead, she named the boundary she would not surrender, her dignity, her independence, her responsibility to those who relied upon her steadiness. She stated that any regard extended toward her must honor those truths, or it would not be borne. The Duke accepted the terms without hesitation. He said that affection built upon imbalance was merely indulgence disguised as care. He declared that if he were to change, it would not be through conquest or rescue, but through choice made with full awareness of consequence. His gaze did not waver, and Eleanor felt the sincerity of it like a challenge. What followed was not confession, but acknowledgement. Each recognized in the other a discipline forged by necessity rather than preference. Eleanor sensed that the Duke saw her not as anomaly or exception, but as equal participant in a negotiation neither had anticipated. The realization steadied her even as it unsettled her resolve. Yet tension remained, unresolved and deliberate. They spoke no promises. They named no future. The restraint that had governed them thus far did not dissolve, it recalibrated. Eleanor felt the shift keenly. Distance no longer protected her. Proximity no longer threatened. The balance had changed, and with it the stakes. When the storm finally eased, the prospect of departure returned with new weight. Eleanor prepared to leave, her composure intact, her mind crowded. The Duke did not detain her. He did not frame her departure as loss or victory. He simply acknowledged that the choice would be hers, and that its absence would be felt. At the threshold, Eleanor paused. She understood then that solitude was no longer neutral ground. To return unchanged would be an act of denial as deliberate as his earlier refusals. She turned, not in appeal, but in honesty, and spoke the question that had formed unbidden, stripped of ornament and pretense. She asked whether he wished to continue as he had, insulated and untouched, or whether he intended to answer the quiet claim his own words had summoned. The inquiry carried no promise, only consequence. It was not flirtation, nor plea, but recognition. In that pause, Eleanor confronted her own fear with unwelcome clarity. She had believed dignity required endurance without desire, that longing was a weakness afforded only to the secure. Now she recognized the cost of such belief, a narrowing of life until survival masqueraded as virtue. She did not wish to be spared risk if the price was perpetual distance. The knowledge did not make her reckless, it made her honest. Honesty, she realized, might be the bravest discipline of all. The truth waited, patient, demanding courage rather than certainty. The Duke did not reply at once. He regarded her with an intensity absent of urgency, as though weighing not her presence, but his own. In the silence that followed, Eleanor felt the future balance, uncertain and irrevocable, awaiting a single word that had not yet been spoken. Tragedy arrived as clarity, sharp and uncompromising, and it demanded decision rather than reflection. The Duke spoke at last, and the sound of his answer altered Eleanor's understanding of him irrevocably. He did not offer reassurance. He did not speak of affection as refuge. He said only that he would not return to a solitude maintained by avoidance, nor would he invite another into it without consent shaped by truth. The words were deliberate, stripped of ornament, and they landed with the weight of oath. Eleanor felt the steadiness of them reach her, not as comfort, but as challenge. What followed was not immediate agreement. Eleanor insisted upon time, not as delay, but as measure. She required proof not of feeling, but of conduct. She spoke of the town's appetite for distortion, of how women bore consequence long after men were absolved. She named the cost she would not pay again. The Duke listened, then answered with resolve equal to her caution. He acted first in daylight. He did not summon Eleanor to private assurance, he addressed the parish openly. He spoke of the winter's hardships, of responsibilities shared, of decisions made through counsel he named and credited. He acknowledged Eleanor Whitcombe publicly, not as beneficiary, but as architect of relief. He spoke with authority that permitted no ambiguity. The town listened, unsettled by the clarity. Reaction followed swiftly. Praise and resentment mingled, but the axis had shifted. Eleanor felt it as a loosening, not of scrutiny, but of inevitability. She had not been defended as exception, she had been recognized as equal contributor. The distinction mattered. It restored to her a measure of agency long withheld. Privately, the Duke offered no triumph. He acknowledged that speech carried risk, and that risk could not be transferred. He asked, without presumption, whether his actions met the standard she required. Eleanor answered honestly that they did not erase danger, but they altered it. She accepted the movement without surrendering vigilance. The balance between them held. Their understanding deepened not through confession, but through practice. Decisions were made together, disputes navigated with respect, boundaries observed without strain. Eleanor discovered that steadiness could coexist with regard, that dignity need not be solitary to be preserved. The Duke learned that leadership could be shared without dilution, that authority strengthened when tempered by trust. Yet resolution demanded declaration, and declaration demanded risk. The Duke chose the moment with care. He did not arrange a spectacle, nor did he conceal intent. He addressed Eleanor with formality unmarred by distance, offering marriage not as shelter or reward, but as partnership governed by mutual obligation. He spoke of estate and parish, of duty enlarged rather than diminished, and of companionship chosen with full awareness of consequence. Eleanor did not answer at once. She measured the offer against her own terms, against the life she had rebuilt through resolve. She acknowledged the fear that acceptance might invite erasure, that becoming duchess could reduce her to symbol. She voiced the condition that would decide her consent, that her voice remain uncurtailed, her labor respected, her dignity intact. She would not be cherished into silence. The Duke accepted without hesitation. He stated that a union predicated upon diminishment would be failure before it began. He pledged not protection, but alignment. The promise was not extravagant, it was exact. Eleanor recognized in it the same discipline that governed her own life, and the recognition steadied her. Consent followed, not as surrender, but as affirmation. Eleanor agreed with composure that masked the gravity of the choice. She understood that acceptance would alter her standing irrevocably, inviting scrutiny sharpened by elevation. Yet she also understood that refusal would be a retreat she no longer desired. She chose presence over avoidance, partnership over isolation. The response of the town arrived unevenly. Approval did not come unanimously, nor did resentment retreat entirely. Eleanor met both with composure practiced to fluency. She did not seek validation, she claimed legitimacy. The Duke supported this posture without display, reinforcing her authority through action rather than proclamation. In the days that followed, arrangements proceeded with restraint. There were no grand gestures, no indulgent assurances. The work continued, winter receded, and the parish stabilized. Eleanor moved through these changes with measured attention, aware that her identity now carried dual weight. She neither resisted nor indulged it. She adapted. Yet beneath the outward order, tension persisted. Eleanor felt it in the quiet moments when choice pressed close, when anticipation threatened to soften her resolve. She reminded herself that affection must not eclipse autonomy, that even principled promises required vigilance. The Duke, attentive without intrusion, appeared to share this understanding. On the eve of their public announcement, Eleanor stood alone with her thoughts. She considered the path she had walked, the discipline that had sustained her, and the risk she now embraced. The decision felt neither triumphant nor fearful. It felt necessary, as though the shape of her life had shifted to accommodate truth long deferred. The Duke joined her without ceremony. He spoke not of tomorrow's declaration, but of continuity. He said that partnership was not a destination reached by vow alone, but a practice renewed daily through choice. Eleanor recognized the intent beneath the words and answered with equal candor, affirming that she would hold him to the same standard she held herself. They stood then at the threshold of irrevocable change, neither romanticizing nor retreating. The world beyond them waited with judgment prepared and curiosity sharpened. Eleanor felt the steadiness she had cultivated align with a new resolve, one that did not require solitude to survive. As night settled, Eleanor understood that the declaration to come would test not only their resolve, but the very terms by which she had learned to live. She did not doubt her choice, yet she sensed that acceptance would demand further reckoning. The future leaned toward her, patient and exacting, awaiting the final step that would bind promise to proof. And she prepared to step. Tragedy concludes not with ruin, but with reckoning. Eleanor discovered that the final cost of dignity was not loneliness, as she had once believed, but courage sustained beyond the moment of choice. The announcement did not arrive as spectacle. It emerged as fact, spoken plainly and received unevenly. Some greeted it as inevitable, others as provocation. Eleanor met neither response with apology. She stood within the consequence she had chosen, her composure no longer defensive but settled, as though the weight she carried had at last found its proper balance. Marriage altered her title, but not her posture. She moved through her days with the same discipline that had defined her obscurity, now sharpened by visibility. The Duke did not ask her to soften. He did not attempt to shield her from resistance. He stood beside her with a steadiness that neither eclipsed nor deferred, allowing her authority to speak without echo. Their union was understood as practical by some, strategic by others. Eleanor did not trouble herself with correction. She had learned that explanation often invited erosion. Instead, she committed herself to continuity, ensuring that partnership did not become performance. The Duke mirrored this restraint, resisting the temptation to recast their bond as redemption. They remained deliberate, attentive, exacting. What tested them most was not opposition, but expectation. Eleanor felt it press from all sides, urging her toward symbolism rather than substance. She resisted by insisting upon work. She maintained oversight, spoke when necessary, withdrew when excess threatened clarity. The discipline steadied her, yet it demanded vigilance that never fully rested. The Duke observed this with respect that deepened rather than softened. He acknowledged, without sentimentality, that affection must coexist with accountability to endure. He did not confuse harmony with ease. When disagreement arose, they met it without retreat, treating discord as inquiry rather than fracture. The practice fortified them. Yet even strength invites trial. Eleanor encountered resistance sharpened by proximity to power. Her decisions were scrutinized with renewed fervor, her missteps anticipated with eagerness. She absorbed the pressure without surrender, but the cost registered. There were moments when the solitude she had relinquished called to her with deceptive calm. It was in one such moment that tragedy returned, quieter than before. A choice demanded compromise she could not accept without betraying her own terms. The cost of refusal was significant, the consequence immediate. Eleanor acted with clarity, and the response was swift. Criticism sharpened, alliances shifted, and silence descended where support had once stood. The Duke did not intervene publicly. He did not override her decision or absorb its fallout. Instead, he waited, allowing her authority to stand or fall on its own merit. The restraint was deliberate, and it wounded even as it honored. Eleanor understood the intent, yet the isolation pressed hard. When the outcome resolved, not in her favor but in preservation of principle, Eleanor felt the weight of endurance settle anew. She had not prevailed, but she had not receded. The distinction mattered. The Duke acknowledged it privately, naming the strength required to choose integrity without assurance of reward. His recognition carried no consolation, only solidarity. In that exchange, Eleanor confronted the final shape of partnership. It was not shelter from consequence, but witness to it. She realized then that her fear had never been of love, but of diminishment. Standing where she did now, diminished she was not, though the cost remained exacting. Time advanced, and with it a steadier rhythm. The parish adjusted. Resistance dulled into acceptance, if not approval. Eleanor continued, not as figurehead, but as participant. The Duke remained constant, neither withdrawing nor dominating. Their bond matured into something less luminous but more enduring than hope. Yet Eleanor knew endings were seldom absolute. Even now, she felt the tension between presence and preservation, between belonging and self-command. The balance required attention she would never outgrow. She did not resent this. She had chosen a life that demanded her fully. One evening, without preface, the Duke asked whether she regretted relinquishing solitude. The question was not accusatory. It was precise. Eleanor considered before answering, measuring truth against habit. She replied that solitude had taught her endurance, but partnership had taught her risk, and that she would not exchange one lesson for the other. The Duke received this without triumph. He answered that he, too, had learned the cost of refusal, and that he remained attentive to the temptation of retreat. The acknowledgment did not weaken them. It clarified the vigilance required to remain open without surrendering self. As Eleanor reflected upon the path she had walked, she recognized that the conflict which had defined her was not resolved, but transformed. Shame had given way to agency, isolation to alignment, restraint to deliberate choice. The struggle persisted, but it no longer diminished her. She sensed that public acceptance was provisional, contingent upon continued restraint. This knowledge did not embitter her, but it refined her judgment. She learned when to speak, when to withhold, and when to allow discomfort to perform its necessary work. Such discernment, earned rather than granted, became the quiet measure of her authority. It demanded patience, courage, humility, balance, resolve. She stood now within a life that required courage not once, but daily. The future offered no guarantees, only continuation. Eleanor accepted this with composure earned through trial. She did not mistake endurance for victory, nor affection for certainty. In the quiet that followed, she understood that the truest resolution lay not in outcome, but in the refusal to disappear. Whatever seasons awaited, she would meet them present, unhidden, and exacting of herself. The winter that had once defined her receded into memory, yet its lesson remained. Warmth, she knew now, was not the absence of cold, but the willingness to remain when retreat beckoned. And as the path ahead narrowed into responsibility yet again, Eleanor stepped forward, aware that the choice to stay would be asked of her more than once, and that each answer would matter anew.